The global press corps gathered in France expected the standard geopolitical script to unfold at the G7 summit. For over 4 decades, international summits involving Canada followed one predictable, unyielding pattern. Canadian leaders would arrive, and mainstream networks like CNN or BBC would immediately demand to know what the American president wanted, what Washington thought, and how Canada planned to appease its massive southern neighbor. In this year of 2026, President Donald Trump arrived in Evian with the full expectation of dominating the stage, ready to leverage the impending renegotiation of the trilateral trade agreement to force total submission from Ottawa. The entire international community braced for another explosive, televised showdown between a volatile superpower and its closest economic dependency. The expected explosion never happened because Prime Minister Mark Carney chose to break the script entirely. Instead of rushing to secure a high-profile televised bilateral meeting with President Donald Trump, Mark Carney did something that left foreign diplomats speechless. He simply walked away from the media spectacle, completely ignoring the established script. While President Donald Trump waited for the cameras to capture his dominance, Mark Carney was hundreds of miles away in a small ancestral village in Ireland, deliberately shifting the entire weight of Canadian foreign policy away from Washington. Mainstream media outlets are currently reporting this move as a massive diplomatic blunder, claiming that Canada is isolating itself from its largest trading partner at a moment of extreme vulnerability. That narrative is fundamentally flawed. The reality hidden beneath the headlines involves a calculated economic realignment that will fundamentally alter the flow of critical global resources and impact the financial stability of everyday citizens. President Donald Trump operates on the belief that global politics is a reality television show driven by public intimidation and personal dominance. Mark Carney is a seasoned technocrat who understands that true power rests in the control of supply chains, critical minerals, and long-term institutional alliances. This deliberate decision to ignore the theater of the American presidency marks the beginning of a quiet war for economic autonomy, a move that effectively cuts off the leverage Washington has held for generations. The mainstream media wants the public to focus entirely on the personal friction between two leaders, but the actual global chess match is happening in the shadows, where the control over the next century of industrial power is being decided on this very historic day. The clock began ticking at exactly 8:45 in the morning on that decisive Thursday in France. Inside the high-security perimeter of the American delegation, senior aides to President Donald Trump leaked a specific internal memo to select media correspondents. The message was unmistakable. The president was prepared to grant Canada a brief 15-minute bilateral audience to discuss the future of the Continental Trade Treaty. It was a classic Washington power play designed to keep Ottawa off balance, anxious, and desperate for American approval. The American strategy relied entirely on theatrical dominance, forcing the Canadian leader to wait nervously outside the conference room while the world watched the spectacle unfold on television screens across the globe. But at exactly 10:14 in the morning, that entire strategy collapsed. While the White House press corps waited for the Canadian motorcade to arrive at the summit gates, Mark Carney was standing in a quiet, windswept village in Ireland, hundreds of miles away from the G7 spotlight. He was visiting the ancestral home of his grandparents, who had immigrated to Canada in the early 1920s. The contrast was deliberate. The timing was calculated. The statement was undeniable. He was not rushing to catch a flight. He was not begging for an invitation. He was not playing the game. President Donald Trump operates through the optics of immediate public confrontation, using aggressive social media posts and sudden tariff threats to paralyze his opponents. He is the ultimate performer who demands that every global leader act as a supporting character in his personal narrative. Mark Carney is the exact opposite. He is a cold, calculating former central banker who measures geopolitical power through long-term economic structures rather than daily news cycles. He understood that the moment he entered a room to debate President Donald Trump on camera, he would lose the narrative. The only way to win was to deny the American president his audience. While President Donald Trump sat in Evian wondering why the cameras were not rolling, the actual work was already happening in total silence. At 11:35 in the morning, the Canadian Minister of Trade, Dominic LeBlanc, alongside the lead trade negotiator, Janice Charette, walked into a secure, windowless briefing room on the lower levels of the summit venue. They did not bring television crews. They did not issue aggressive press releases. They simply sat down with the United States Trade Representative Jameson Greer. For exactly 2 hours and 47 minutes, these professionals conducted a highly technical, completely unemotional negotiation regarding continental supply chains and automotive tariffs. The Canadian negotiators presented dense spreadsheets detailing the deep economic dependencies that tied the American manufacturing heartland to Canadian energy and raw materials. They bypassed the political theater entirely. They treated the entire multi-billion-dollar relationship as a serious corporate negotiation rather than a reality television drama. By 2:15 in the afternoon, the press room in Evian fell completely silent as international journalists realized there would be no dramatic public showdown, no televised handshake, and no hostile tweets from the presidential suite. Mark Carney had successfully decoupled Canada's national strategy from the personal whims of the White House. He left the grandstanding to the media and left the complex trade mechanics to the technocrats. President Donald Trump had prepared a massive diplomatic trap for his northern neighbor, but the trap remained empty. To understand the true magnitude of this shift, one must look far beneath the surface of the daily news cycle. For more than 5 decades, the foundational architecture of Canadian foreign policy rested on a single, unshakable premise: absolute economic and security reliance on the United States. Every prime minister in Ottawa understood that the nation's prosperity was tied directly to the whims of the White House and the decisions made in Washington. If the American economy sneezed, Canada caught pneumonia. This systemic vulnerability created a deeply ingrained pattern of behavior where Canadian diplomats constantly sought approval from their southern neighbor, treating the bilateral relationship as the alpha and omega of their global existence. But the geopolitical landscape of 2026 is no longer defined by the old rules of the 20th century. The current friction between Ottawa and Washington is not merely a superficial clash of personalities or a dispute over trade rhetoric on television. The real battleground lies in the profound global transition toward green technology, advanced computing, and the control of critical supply chains. Beneath the soil of Ontario, Quebec, and the Northwest Territories lie some of the largest untapped deposits of lithium, cobalt, nickel, and rare earth elements on Earth. These minerals are the lifeblood of the next century, essential for everything from advanced semiconductors to electric vehicle batteries and high-tech military defense systems. President Donald Trump has consistently utilized aggressive protectionist policies and sudden tariff threats to isolate the American market, operating under an America First doctrine that views traditional alliances as financial liabilities. For generations, Washington assumed that Canada had no choice but to feed its raw materials directly into the American industrial machine under whatever terms the White House dictated. Mark Carney recognizes that this total dependency has become an existential threat to Canadian sovereignty. The true strategy behind the recent diplomatic maneuver is a deliberate effort to leverage Canada's vast natural wealth to secure a completely independent seat at the global table. Instead of surrendering these critical resources to a volatile and protectionist administration in Washington, Canada is actively diversifying its alliances through a structural pivot toward Europe. Mark Carney is quietly assembling a coalition of like-minded middle powers that share a common commitment to an international order based on predictable rules and multilateral cooperation. This is why his recent engagements with French President Emmanuel Macron and British Prime Minister Keir Starmer represent a tectonic shift in global alignment. Europe is desperately seeking a stable, democratic, and secure source of critical minerals to power its own technological transition without relying on adversarial nations or unpredictable partners. By presenting Canada as a reliable alternative, Mark Carney is creating a new economic corridor across the Atlantic Ocean. He is demonstrating that Ottawa is no longer willing to place all of its economic bets on a single country. This strategy uses Canada's immense material wealth as diplomatic leverage, effectively telling Washington that its northern neighbor has alternative options. The traditional pattern of Canadian deference has been replaced by a cold, calculated exercise in strategic autonomy. The historical iceberg has finally fractured, and the underlying reality shows that Canada is no longer content to exist merely as an economic satellite of the United States. President Donald Trump believed that his aggressive public posturing and threats to terminate the Canada-United States-Mexico agreement would force Ottawa into immediate submission. He assumed that by withholding public attention, he could leverage Canada's economic anxiety to extract sweeping concessions for American industries. However, this high-stakes pressure campaign triggered a powerful boomerang effect that is currently reverberating through the financial markets of Washington and New York. By refusing to engage in a public media circus, Canada effectively neutralized the primary weapon in the presidential arsenal. The aggressive social media posts and public ultimatums lost their coercive power the moment the Canadian delegation chose to treat the entire dispute as a quiet corporate negotiation rather than a matter of political survival. The hard economic data reveals that the White House significantly miscalculated the balance of dependencies between the two nations. For decades, the political rhetoric in Washington suggested that Canada was the sole beneficiary of continental free trade. The reality on the trading floors tells a completely different story. In the automotive manufacturing hubs of Michigan and Ohio, major American corporations rely entirely on a seamless, minute-by-minute flow of parts and raw materials across the northern border. If the trade agreement expires or faces severe disruption, the highly integrated supply chains of Detroit will collapse within days. Internal data from the American manufacturing sector shows that over 20 states in the United States depend on Canada as their #1 export market, supporting millions of American jobs. As the realization of this interdependence set in during the G7 summit, the financial markets reacted with immediate volatility. Institutional investors on Wall Street quietly began reassessing the risks of a prolonged economic conflict with Ottawa. Shares of major American industrial conglomerates and manufacturing companies experienced sharp downward adjustments as corporate leaders realized that a trade war with Canada would devastate their own quarterly earnings. The domestic political pressure began mounting on the administration from within its own borders, as influential industry lobby groups and corporate executives realized that the president's aggressive strategy was actively harming American economic interests. The threat of tariffs ceased to be an effective leverage point and instead became a self-inflicted wound for the domestic economy. While Washington found itself constrained by its own aggressive rhetoric, European capitals quickly moved to exploit the strategic opening. European leaders like Emmanuel Macron and Keir Starmer recognized that Canada's pivot toward the Atlantic provided a historic opportunity to secure their own economic futures. European investment funds began shifting capital into Canadian resource development projects, specifically targeting the vast lithium and nickel reserves in Ontario and Quebec. This influx of foreign direct investment from Europe provides Canada with the financial cushion necessary to withstand any short-term economic pressure from the United States. President Donald Trump intended to isolate Canada on the global stage, but his actions instead drove America's closest ally directly into the arms of an enthusiastic and wealthy European coalition. The ultimate receipt of this summit is clear. The United States needs this trade relationship far more than the administration is willing to admit publicly, and the current strategy has left Washington holding a diminishing hand. Geopolitical maneuvers at international summits often seem completely disconnected from the daily financial realities of ordinary citizens. The abstract debates over trade frameworks and supply chain diversification inside closed conference rooms feel remote from the immediate pressures of paying monthly bills and managing household budgets. This perspective is a dangerous misconception because the structural shift currently unfolding between Ottawa and Washington will directly impact the personal finances of millions of individuals across North America. The geopolitical friction of 2026 is translating into a real-world economic realignment that will reconfigure consumer prices, employment stability, and retirement portfolios. The decision by Canada to pivot toward a European coalition means that the traditional flow of raw materials and energy southward will change permanently. For decades, American consumers benefited from cheap, stable access to Canadian lumber, oil, electricity, and manufactured parts. As Canadian industries begin directing these critical resources across the Atlantic Ocean to fulfill new commitments with France and the United Kingdom, the immediate result for the American market will be scarcity. This scarcity will inevitably drive up the cost of production for domestic industries, forcing major manufacturing corporations to pass those expenses directly onto the consumer. Everyday purchases, from the electronics in your pocket to the vehicles in your garage, will experience substantial price increases as production costs surge. For Canadian citizens, this transition introduces a different set of significant economic vulnerabilities. Breaking away from a historic reliance on the massive American marketplace creates immediate turbulence for domestic businesses that depend on cross-border trade. While the long-term goal of strategic autonomy offers greater independence, the short-term transition threatens to disrupt manufacturing jobs in provinces like Ontario and Quebec. Small and medium enterprises that lack the capital to pivot toward European markets face sudden revenue declines, directly impacting employment security and wage growth for local workers. Furthermore, global financial markets dislike prolonged structural instability. The ongoing trade friction undermines investor confidence, causing major fluctuations on Wall Street and the Toronto Stock Exchange. These market contractions directly diminish the value of personal retirement funds, mutual funds, and long-term savings accounts held by ordinary families. The macro-level chess match between Mark Carney and President Donald Trump is not an academic exercise. It is a direct disruption of your personal purchasing power, your job security, and your financial future. The geopolitical trajectory of the next 90 days will likely follow one of three distinct paths. In the first scenario, which represents the optimal outcome for Ottawa, Canada successfully finalizes a series of high-level binding agreements with the European Union and the United Kingdom regarding critical minerals and energy security. This sudden consolidation of transatlantic alliances effectively neutralizes Washington's leverage, forcing the administration of President Donald Trump to abandon its aggressive tariff threats and renew the Continental Trade Agreement on fair, balanced terms. The second, more volatile scenario involves immediate economic retaliation from the White House. Driven by a perceived lack of public deference from a traditional ally, President Donald Trump could implement sweeping blanket tariffs on all Canadian imports, specifically targeting automotive parts, lumber, and energy sectors. This action would instantly ignite a bitter, full-scale North American trade war, severely disrupting integrated supply chains, causing rapid inflation for American consumers, and testing the financial resilience of the Canadian economy to its absolute limit. The third and most probable scenario is a period of prolonged tactical friction and quiet diplomacy. Publicly, the political rhetoric from Washington will remain intensely protectionist, designed to satisfy domestic audiences and project absolute dominance. Beneath the surface, however, the professional negotiators in Evian will continue their meticulous, untelevised work to preserve the essential mechanics of continental trade. Meanwhile, Mark Carney will quietly accelerate the structural integration of Canadian resources into the European industrial matrix, steadily decreasing vulnerability to the political shifts of the United States over the next several years. This historic confrontation at the G7 summit forces a fundamental reevaluation of how global power operates in the 21st century. True national sovereignty no longer belongs to the leader with the loudest voice on social media, nor does it belong to the nation that generates the most sensational headlines on international news networks. In this year of 2026, true power belongs to those who control the physical infrastructure of the global economy, those who secure the critical supply chains of the future, and those who possess the strategic patience to ignore political theater in favor of long-term institutional stability. The international order is shifting away from a unipolar world centered entirely in Washington toward a complex, multi-layered arena of competing interests. You are witnessing the blueprint of a nation attempting to rewrite its destiny by breaking a half-century of total economic dependence. This choice carries immense risk and the potential for historic rewards. You must determine whether Canada is executing a brilliant masterstroke of strategic autonomy or stepping into a dangerous economic trap that will devastate its own citizens. State your analysis in the comments below. Choose between the protectionist realism of the White House or the calculated multilateralism of Ottawa, and subscribe to ensure you never miss the hidden realities behind the global headlines.